Hey guys, I'm here with Alyssa Olenick. She is a PhD in exercise physiology, specializing in women's fitness and metabolism. Today I get to ask her all of my burning questions about women's fitness, differences between men and women's training, all those sorts of fun topics. We also do a fantastic leg day. But make sure to check Alyssa out. She's super smart, bunch of great information. Alyssa, where can we find you?
Hang out mostly on Instagram or YouTube, Docless Fitness. My training programs are the list method, but if you kind of just go to doclessfitness.com or Docless Fitness on Instagram, I feel like that's the great launch point to find blog, podcast, YouTube, articles, all the things in one place. The 100-mile recovery was actually my fastest ultra recovery that I've ever had.
Really?
I thought that was super interesting. I took a full week off. Yeah. And then I took another week off running, mostly because my toenails were fucked. I mean, I did technically endurance stuff growing up, but I would say my base is fundamentally strength. And then,
Sure.
Even though I've always ran and done endurance, like I consider myself more like a baseline strength person.
Yeah.
But I always joke that I have like a really good aerobic system where I can literally go all day, and I can go very short and hard. But
It's
that
the middle
like,
threshold, yeah.
I like doesn't exist. Like I'm like it does not exist physiologically. It does,
Yeah.
but like that for me, pushing that 10 out of 10 there is definitely a skill that I'm working on. It's hard. That's what I'm trying to refine right now after my 100-mile year. Like I'll do like these hyrox conditioning workouts, and afterwards I'm like, you did not push. And granted, every workout you shouldn't be pushing out of 10, but I'm like, you can push harder.
That's how I would have described my fitness for my entire life until the last couple of years. And not that either style of training is right or wrong, it's just dependent on your goals. But for most of my training career, I trained very polarized. It was either very easy zone 2 or like full send, really short, intense interval session. But I never did long threshold workouts like the 4x2 mile workout I'm doing now is like my staple. That was not something that I would have prioritized much before.
Yes. No, I'm definitely more of a pyramidal person. I feel like my mission in life is like justice for zone 3 and the luteal phase.
Yeah.
Like justice for both of them. I need to know that I am the pogo hop.
What?
Queen.
You are?
All I do is pogo hops.
Really?
Ever since I blew up my fucking Achilles. You know how I hurt my Achilles originally?
How?
I went out dancing in heels. That's literally how I hurt myself. And that was like an injury that plagued me for like a year. I used to do a ton of plyos like in high school and college. And then I went full bro powerlifting. And then I basically was doing like powerlifting, bodybuilding, or CrossFit. But then I like hurt my Achilles and I was like, oh shit, I need to actually like train resilience in my lower body, not just like I didn't do calf raises. I didn't because I have really big calves. So I was like, oh, I have enough muscle. I don't need more.
We should mark where you jump to. Try to beat
We
it.
should. Let me get a cone.
I like to have a visual target.
Get that. One thing I got on Alex.
That's pretty great.
I can't run a sub-3 marathon and I can't hip airplane with weight. It's funny, when you made the post about calling people out with hip airplane with weight, I was doing it for rehab and I was like, fuck, Alex calling me out.
Yeah.
Alex fucking calling me out. I'm definitely not as like impressively strong as I used to be, but most people think that it's like really impressive just because I'm a female.
You don't get like 200-pound dudes in your comments saying they can bench that?
No, I don't. I don't. I have a very respectful community of men who follow me like for the right reasons and like just respect me and learn from me and aren't like always trying to mansplain. Kudos to the guys who follow me. I think we're good. We can probably squat now.
Yeah.
Now that I've showed you up in the
that I've been put to shame.
One win that I get today.
Right out of the gate.
This seems abysmal compared to your marathon time, but I'd like to do a 3:45 for my first, and I think I have that in me. I think physiologically I have a 3:30 in me, but I don't think like my first marathon is my
I think most people
3:30.
can run a much better marathon than they think if they actually do enough of the threshold work and the marathon pace work. Because I think the mistake people make is they look at elite marathoners running 120 to 140 miles a week. They're doing 80% of their runs or 90% of their runs really slow. And they do the same thing, but they apply that to like a 30-mile-a-week training program. I'm like, that's a great way to never run fast.
Yes. My biggest dilemma with clients, because we have a lot of runners, is that concept, but then also explaining to people who are like beginners or training for distance for the first time ever that they just can't do 50% speed work while they're also increasing their volume and training for something for the first time. But then also explaining that like, if it's not 80%, you also won't die. But then also explaining that like your tissues need to adapt. Like you just can't decide to increase your volume and your intensity by double in a week and then expect that to not backfire. I know when I scheduled this, I was like, man, I'm gonna look so bad on Alex YouTube because I literally haven't lifted for like 2.5 weeks prior to doing this. Kilimanjaro, coming back from that, I expected last week to blow me up more and it didn't. And I think one of the reasons it didn't was not just being on our feet all day, but it was a lot more vert than I feel like people advertise it to be. I mean, I was fine. I didn't think it was that hard, but I would feel like, at least for me, I was high stepping like every day.
How many days did you climb over?
6. I think it was like 38 miles. They take it pole, slow. I always have a hard time knowing where the box is.
So what exactly is your thesis on?
My master's and PhD work were all actually on metabolic flexibility, which is funny because I feel like I never talk about it. So the biggest way that people test metabolic flexibility, it's really like, okay, well, how do you respond to just like a huge mixed macro meal? Like if we just give you a ton of calories, how is your body essentially able to shuttle those appropriately is the best way to think about it. And then I started to have the thought process, okay, well, like we test this during postprandial, or postprandial means post-eating for anyone watching that doesn't know what that means. But I was like, but exercise itself is also a test of metabolic capacity. My first study was just like a high protein diet intervention with women to see if it improved metabolism. It's not the best study, but we found that women who lifted more frequently had better metabolic flexibility, right? So shocking, fitness is associated with that. But then the second study, I was like, okay, how does someone's postprandial response relate to their exercise response? And I wanted to come up with a protocol of like testing that. So I did basically 4x3 HIIT. And what I essentially found with that was that, yeah, people who oxidize more fat after a high fat meal also oxidize more fat during the HIIT interval. And also like that was also related to VO2 max status, which makes sense. Metabolic flexibility essentially is heavily dependent on fitness status, primarily aerobic fitness status and body fatness. So that was my first study of that. But I had an interesting observation with that where it wasn't a huge sample size when we split this. You would consider this more like pilot or preliminary. But when I split the men and the women by high and low fitness status, lower fit men's discrepancy between higher fit men wasn't as great as like low fit women to regular women or the men, right? And I had this underlying theory that I would have to test out where I think that, you know, everyone talks about estrogen being a positive, fat burning, oxidizing, promoting thing in women, but I think a lot of that has to do, or is enhanced is a better way of saying it, with the interaction of exercise stimulus and estrogen receptors in the muscles. Like I just don't think at baseline, every woman's like going to be a phenomenal endurance person just because you're women. Like you need that stress of training. So I think there's probably some sort of interaction that happens with that magnifies that when they are trained, right? So then I basically expanded on that for my final dissertation study, but I also did fitness status and menstrual cycle phase and birth control use. And we also separated by fitness status. And what we essentially found is that fitness status mattered more for your ability to oxidize fat or be metabolically flexible than your birth control use or your menstrual cycle phase. Some of that comes from the fact that intensity and feeding state, I think, overrides, and we've seen this in other studies too, overrides metabolic differences that we see. So we do see sometimes metabolic differences at low relative intensities, and a lot of that's in like steady state, lower intensity exercise, but it hasn't really been classified really well with the HIIT stuff. I think there's only been a few studies that have really looked at HIIT responses in the menstrual cycle. So I think that like once you add the intensity component, it doesn't matter. Or two, we have other studies that we see differences between follicular and luteal phase, but when you're fed or even caffeinated, they go away. You have so many other influences that affect your training, but essentially fitness status mattered more than menstrual cycle phase or birth control use, which I think is in alignment with some other things that we see out there. Of course, this field needs more research. So that's always the disclaimer of like my one study isn't like end all be all, but I mean, it also confirms a lot of stuff we see in men or also like other trends we see in women's data as well. So kind of fits my bias that we should do more cardio.
My introduction to the idea of metabolic flexibility came years and years ago for me, getting into ultra running, hearing ultra runners talk about like being a fat burning
machine. Did you go keto?
All that
do all
kind
the
of
fasted
stuff.
Training?
And I did all the fasted training. I never went full keto, but like now is like the more liberally I fuel, like the more I fuel in my workouts, I can just train harder. And I'd rather make my training harder by running faster than make my training harder by being hungry.
You know, we obsess over the mechanisms of fasting and turning on all these pathways and all this stuff. But I'm like, do you know what also turns on those pathways? Like the stress of cardiovascular training. Essentially, people are trying to mimic what they get. And I would argue a larger dose, a more significant, meaningful stimulus from aerobic training. Aerobic training is creating an acute energy deficit in the cell. That's like how it works. That's how the stimulation of the pathways turns on. So I'm like, you could just go for a run instead of starving yourself. And if you eat beforehand, you're going to have a higher quality session. And at the end of the day, if your aerobic capacity or VO2 max or lactate threshold shift or go up, like that's a better indicator of one, metabolic flexibility, but two, ability to oxidize fat than like even those Volek studies that were original. Like Volek actually came to UGA years ago, which I thought was interesting because he's a big keto guy. And this isn't shitting on him or anything like that. And like, yes, people oxidize more fat, but they were so blunted at their high in capacity. It's like, is it worth it?
When people would say they've gotten better at burning fat, I'm like, is that on an absolute basis or a relative basis? And if it's relative, what you're really saying is you're just worse at burning carbs.
Yeah, it's an important component of metabolic flexibility. I think people forget that it's not just being better at burning fat, it's being better at switching between the two. There's this review paper that was like my Bible in my master's and early PhD by M-U-O-I-O or whatever it is, from like 2014. But there's a great figure in there that's like a stoplight analogy. And it's like, if you're metabolically flexible, you have carbs, fats, and proteins all coming in, but like your crossing guard at your cell, like basically, you know, the cell regulators are better at like letting in, like you go here, you oxidize this, ramp this up, this goes to storage, versus the people who are bad at it, then it's just pulling in the bloodstream. So then you have elevated triglycerides, elevated glucose, more inflammation, leads to that plaque buildup, ROS production, all that stuff, because it's just like metabolic haywire. So I think people forget that it's not just, oh, I'm good at burning fat, which is that's a positive adaptation, but it's also like, if you drink like a huge glass of orange, you like orange juice as much as me, I'm pretty sure.
I drink a half gallon of orange juice a day.
I love orange. I knew that about you. It's like, can you handle that really well too? It's not just like, oh, I'm good at burning fat, which most people don't even know if they're good at burning fat, right? Like, unless you're doing VO2 max testing, right? But like, if your 5K goes up, I'm gonna assume that you're getting better at burning fat, right? Like if you can stay in zone 2 for longer, I'm gonna assume you're better at burning fat, right? But I think people forget that you should be able to switch between, like if you go from an interval session, you should be able to ramp up carbohydrate oxidation. Like in my studies, people ramped up carbohydrate oxidation. The difference was that when they were recovering, you're able to oxidize a lot more fat and recover and use oxygen more efficiently in between, instead of being metabolically blunted there and then lactates pooling because you're basically have like the crossing guard stopping the cell wall more or less.
I used to conduct a lot of VO2 max tests and would talk people through like, this is your respiratory quotient, this is what it means. But I was never satisfied with the way that me and my team were trained in on the equipment and like taught to interpret it, because it was very much just percentage and relative use, where I'd have someone who's like a 15-minute 5K athlete who like at some point in their test, they're burning 1,500 calories an hour. And I have to be like, oh, your fat burn's not very good. It's only, 60% here where it should be 70%.
But they're just way more capable of hanging out at a higher heart rate, which is a good thing. Based
on your experience researching metabolic flexibility, is it fair to just say like we shouldn't think about it independently of aerobic fitness and like just focus on aerobic fitness? Or are there things related to metabolic flexibility specifically that are worth talking about?
I do think it's a really important component of health, but I think it's kind of a scapegoat catch-all term for like just being metabolically healthy. Like type 2 diabetes is technically metabolic inflexibility, but like what's a really great way to stimulate, or if you want to argue very CrossFit-y to say you can reverse it, you know what I mean with it? Some degree you probably can. Some people maybe are gone too far, but I think that it's adiposity and activity levels are like, from everything I've read in the literature, like that's those two things are the biggest drivers. I don't want to say everyone needs to go have a VO2 max of 60, right, to be healthy, but like I think it's more for most people, like the things to focus on are being active across the day. Like, I'm not obsessive about steps, but I think you should break up your sitting pretty frequently, like being more active, like increasing that from your baseline. Like being super sedentary is probably not a good thing. Increasing aerobic fitness capacity. And then I always give the disclaimer of like, if it makes sense for you, not everyone wants to change their body or pursue fat loss, but that is a significant driver we see when people lose fat, even at the muscle level. Like the original studies of metabolic flexibility from like the early 2000s, where they were taking basically muscle biopsies or doing tracer studies within the muscle, like people who lose fat, their fat oxidation in their muscle cells just went up because of that. So there is that tie to it. But then of course, like sleep affects metabolism. I think that's huge too. And like insulin sensitivity and things like that, and nutrition. So it's not like lifestyle doesn't matter, but it's more so focus on the components of what improves metabolic health overall. It's kind of like everyone who gets obsessed with increasing VO2 max, but I would just say increase your 5K time or your mile time, or can you run for an hour, like, or do cardio for an hour? Like, I think those are more appreciative measures of actual improvements than like people are like obsessing over what their Garmin says their fitness is. It's kind of similar to that, where I'm like, yeah, you can improve and increase these, but like the things that you do to improve it aren't going to be these like super hacky protocols that you're doing, or like there's not a special diet of like where you're chasing the tail of your fat oxidation all the time, because your body's going to oscillate in and out of carb and fat oxidation every time you eat or when you sleep or when you go from rest to exercise or rest to eating. Like that's normal. And I think too many people get obsessive like with glucose spikes or with chasing the fat oxidation. And like those are normal physiological responses. It's more so about how your body can recover from those. And you improve the recovery by either decreasing systemic inflammation and or increasing your body's capacity to oxidize fat or recover or be insulin sensitive, which comes from kind of the same crap anyone with a CPT is saying people to do anyway, right? Like you don't need a PhD to say like being better at cardio and having more muscle and being active and sleeping and eating well is like good for you. But my bias is more people should do more cardio than they think they should. But like I'm also pro lifting. I always have to give that disclaimer. Like I'm like, no, I'm pro muscle, but the conditioning capacity of that muscle also makes us better at like fat and carb utilization as well. So it's nuanced, but like just get fitter is usually a easy like response.
People get caught up in the what substrate they're burning at any given time. And I think they misapply the principle of specificity of like, if I'm burning more fat, that's going to help me be better at burning fat. Where it's like, you don't have to train at fat max to maximally improve your fat burning capacity. Like you just need the aerobic capacity. If you train to burn as many carbs as possible, then you've depleted your glycogen.
And then
what do you have to burn next?
And then you're going to switch back into, I mean, we have those studies too, where people train fasted and then they switch to more carbohydrate utilization later in the day. And that's exactly, that's such a good point, because that's exactly what your body does. It's shifting in response to what it needs. So like, if you're depleting it, what's your body going to do? What's going to shift to what it needs to function? And you're not going to like magically hack that unless you do go purely keto and you're just changing your acetylcholase pathway entirely. Yeah, the body's smart. It's going to shift and it's going to use what it needs to use and put it where it needs to go. And I think people just spend too much time trying to hack that. And it's like, to some degree, I guess you can, but like, I don't know, my bias is always the hack. It's just like, get fitter. It's so funny because I have all this knowledge and this PhD work, and sometimes I just get so cynical because I'm like, especially being like higher level science, like you see these nitty gritty questions. I'm like, yeah, this is important. We should study this. But I'm like, sometimes I'm like, oh no, another study that says exercise is good and makes it better. Shocking. Like, I'm like, so yeah, I mean, there is nuance to it, but I think with all things fitness, like I agree with explaining people the information they want, because at the end of the day, they're going to then go to the people who are a little more hacky and are over exploiting that stuff because they want to understand those things, versus like making them know like, okay, well, this is when this might apply to you and it might matter, right? Versus where probably the person's training for their first 5K probably doesn't need to worry about their maximal fat oxidation at all. But the people who are like maximizing training, well, maybe they are experimenting, maybe at the top 1% of like using fasted training, maybe to stimulate things. But like, even then, like in the literature, that's a contention of like, is this a useful tool to maximize performance, or is it just like a theory? Like that's not even something that's like well established, right? If my mom was running a 5K, like the last thing I'd worry about is her hacking her metabolic flexibility for that performance, right? Like the 5K itself is a better measure of everything that she's doing, right?
I feel like the people who worry about it the most are the people who need to worry about it the least.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's how I feel about a lot of the zone 2 stuff too. I explain it to people because they want it, but I feel like half the time I'm saying, but this doesn't really matter to you right now.
So metabolic flexibility, possibly overrated for most people to talk about. Zone 2, maybe overrated for
beginners,
novice people. Compromised running, I think, is overrated for most beginner, like hyrox, obstacle course athletes. They're always worried about like, can they run when they're tired? I'm like, you can't run
in general, period. It's hard because I have so much love for beginners. And like, even in my programs, we just redid our beginner program. I have more beginner programs to scale down to people that are like even lower fitness than like what we had before. So I never want to like, I'm so delicate about like my hot takes on beginners because I feel like beginners are also the most like sensitive to like feeling bad about their fitness and their stuff. But there's definitely times where I'm like, this just doesn't matter. Like I'm doing a lot of compromise running. But like, even for me, more importantly is just, can I run faster? That's the biggest component of my training right now. I'm like, yeah, it's important for me to like, be like, you don't even recover in the compromise running. That's where like metabolic flexibility or being able to oxidize fat, like your recovery is what matters more than your actual, like the compromise running, like your ability to have that aerobic capacity that you can like recover in that 5, 10, 15, 20 seconds coming off that station into that running matters more for your ability to run fast. And that's coming from just like high volume, easy stuff with a mix of hard running.
And a lot of just pacing stuff too. Like I've tried to troubleshoot people who they're like, my compromise running sucks or whatever. And I'll look at their results from a hyrox. And I'm like, you're someone who is running like an 8-minute mile pace in your race. but you just rip like a 3:15 1K row, of course you felt terrible trying to run after that. Like,
Yeah.
that was such a mismatch.
Like you're not, yeah, because I always use like the saying with clients, like you're only as good as your worst interval. Like being able to pace yourself evenly across like workouts or intervals or training is probably more important than like sending it.
There's only so much you can come back from.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Race car analogy, if you're racing on a track and you're approaching a turn, there's two main strategies. You can do slow in, fast out, or fast in, slow out for a turn. And like depending on your weight distribution in the car and like where your engine sits, you might be someone who needs to do a slow and fast out turn.
Yeah.
Or a fast and slow out turn.
Yeah, that's such a good analogy.
And with pacing like a hyrox, I'm like, are you the type of person who needs to ease up a little bit on like the row or the obstacle or the sled or whatever it is, and then like you can just run right out of the gate? Or are you going to be like smoother, steadier into the row, and then you have to ease up on the run? And it
just depends on your strengths and weaknesses, right? Yeah, I completely agree. And I guess, that advice is more so for people who are like, oh, I'm a little blown up from this. Like, you have to recover from it. You can't just like sprint right into it. Yeah. But I guess the main takeaway from that then is don't blow yourself up.
I personally lean towards slow and fast out of like, if I'm in an obstacle race, like when I was doing a lot of Spartans, I'm like, relax, breathe. Like I would rather my heart rate come down a little bit on the obstacle and then be able to hit the ground running than vice versa. Yes. But that's just what worked for me. Yeah. No, I guess we'll see. I have no idea what my strategy is yet. My physiological basis for my like slow and fast out approach is most people who are not elite at the row or the ski or biking or like all these other things other than running. Like if you're not an elite cyclist, your threshold heart rate on a bike is going to be lower than your threshold heart rate running. Yes. But I think people get into a multimodal event and they want to try to hold a steady heart rate. Yes. And I'm like, if you're doing a modality where your threshold is lower, your heart rate should probably go down on that, not up on that. I agree, because I struggle with ergs. And I struggle with ergs in part because I'm small, right? Like, it sucks for us. It sucks, right? Like I'm so bad at rowing. I can push so hard and it's still not that fast. So like my approach is I'm not going to try to be a hero in those events. I'm going to hold a pace that I know is like, I can run out of. Yeah, it's exactly like holding pace that I can run out of instead of try to make up a minute of time. Yeah. Developing my hyrox strategy in real time right now. Yeah. From a marketing perspective, it looks stupid if I don't do hyroxes and we're releasing hyrox programs. Like my coaches are doing them and they know what they're doing, but like I have to go do this now, right? Like it makes sense that like I do it too, but it's going to be a lot of fun. Do you feel a lot of obligation to like do things because you're a coach, like do certain events because of what you talk about or things like that? Yes and no. The year that I got injured, I definitely was going to do a 50 miler just because I felt like I had to for my brand. So I learned a hard lesson with that. Yeah. But I do feel a lot of, especially with the shift in the social media content, and this isn't shade to someone like you who is both freakishly strong and freakishly fit. Like I'm fit than most people, but I'm not like, I'm more above average strong, right? But I'm not like, even my fastest running, like I'm not going to be a sub 3 hour marathon runner. I just don't think physiologically like I have that in me. But I do feel a lot of this weird pressure now that like, if I'm not more impressive, then people won't take my brand seriously because they don't care about my credentials, unless they're maybe already in my ecosystem. But like in order to attract new clients and new people, I do feel this more outside pressure because people are obsessed with those like top end people. Yeah. And I'm like, I can't compete with that. And so I don't have like bad body image or feel bad about myself. Like if I wasn't a coach, I like myself. I don't feel bad about myself. I'm trained hard because I like it. I was going to say, you can compete with that. You're 5'1" and you out jumped me today. That is true. But I do feel like sometimes there's this just like underlying like awareness that I'm like not good enough. I feel it. Do you know what I mean? There's so many just crazy freaks out there. And this is very objective. Like this, when I say this to people, they're like, don't talk badly about yourself. And I'm like, this is 100% like business owner hat. Like I'm watching other YouTube content. I'm paying attention to what my people who pay attention to me are paying attention to, right? Like it's more of like a completely objective, like brand analysis, not like I feel bad about myself. But I have a personal rule that anything I do for my business or my brand has to be something that I would do on my own, right? Like, so example, like I won't change my appearance for Instagram just because you're in the fishbowl of people's like observations. Do you know what I mean? And like, I am intentionally doing the hyrox stuff and even the marathon as a community thing with people, but like
they feel in alignment with things that I would just want to do in the season of self for myself. Because I want to get faster, I want to get fitter. So it makes sense for me this year. Like, let's do 6 months of hyrox focused training and then shift to 6 months of marathon focused training. And that's a good natural progression after my 100-miler year, right? And then next year, my plan is to get back into like that bigger mountain shape, assuming we move out west. So like, it feels in alignment with what I would want to be doing anyway, but there is strategy to it, right? You know what I mean? Like, there's definitely, like, I'm bringing my video crew and marketing it, and like, there is a little bit of intentionality of it. But I think after that injury year and coming back from being so out of shape publicly, I had to have a lot of like, this is what I am, this is my fitness, this is like, and I'm very logical and objective, and definitely like, sometimes I think I respond to things more like a man does and not as much as a woman does. Like, I think women get more emotional about those things. And I'm just like, I suck right now. I'm slow. I'm unfit. It is what it is. And I was like, this year, what do I need to work on? I'm like, fucking slow. So like, this is what we need to work on. So, I mean, I do things intentionally for my brand, but what I would say is I more so make choices that I'd make for myself, but then I'm really good at marketing those choices. If there's anything out the gate that I coach differently with men and women, I think the biggest thing is psychology. I'm not saying I'm an expert in psychology, but I think social influence on their exercise perceptions and body, which ties into like the conversation we were just having, like, of all the things, I think that plays a bigger role on females' exercise adherence, beliefs, progress than like anything else. Everyone's like, physiology is so different. I'm like, no, you're afraid to eat more. You're afraid to give up volume. You're afraid to lift heavy because you don't want to bulk, or you have terrible body image, or socially you need or want higher levels of social support, or you're more like cerebral.
You're still so fast.
When it comes to women, I think the one thing that I do think is important for consideration is pelvic floor. Yeah. That's outside of my niche and expertise. So I'm not going to act like this is like my, like I'm going to have some like amazing thing. But I think that, especially when we think about like pregnancy and postpartum, again, not my specialization, but that's the one area where I think that it is like, should be more considered, which that is very female specific, right? Yeah. That kind of stuff. Like the menstrual cycle and menopause, it's kind of like a lot of like, okay, let's just like work around your fatigue or your perception and your levels of things. Like training hard still works. Again, not my expertise. Like I think women can train harder than they think during pregnancy, but I think it's more that like end of pregnancy into early postpartum and recovery is probably a time period that is more like female specific in nature because of the implications of pregnancy and childbirth.
As it's a thing, I think it like opens itself up for
so much
misinformation too.
I know.
Like some of the stuff I see with like postpartum, I'm like, you just made that up.
Yes.
You 100% just made that up.
Yeah. So again, not my expertise. I definitely have peers that I trust and defer a lot more to with that stuff. This is probably too late for me, but I actually just don't know. Oh, that wins me.
I hate your front squats. It sucks.
Well, they like stand your fucking
I know.
vocal cords the entire time.
I feel like a common tactic from like misinformation people is they will tell you a couple like commonly accepted true things first. They'll be like, doctors don't want you to know this, but you should drink water. And you're like, yeah. And then like 5 slides later, they're selling you on some like $200 supplement or something like that.
Yeah, and that's why you should inject beef tallow straight into your veins. Discount code Tiffany.
But I see that with like the women's fitness stuff. They'll be like, women aren't small men, like women are underrepresented in research, and I'll like say all these things that are true, and I'm like, okay, I'm on board.
But also, okay, those things are true, but also I think they get so misrepresented in the industry because yes, women aren't small men, but we're not a different species. We see in mouse studies that mechanical tension works for hypertrophy, right? And that isn't different. I think that people think like, well, women are different, so then everything's different. And you're like, the basic principles of most stuff don't not work in women. Like we have studies where women adapt and make progress and get stronger or fitter using like the stuff that we've known for everyone. It's not like, it's like they want this like 100% unique application of things and then they use that as that. And it drives me nuts. I've said that before for years. Like we're not small men, but we're not a different species. Like the basic foundational principles of fitness or physiological adaptation don't magically like not apply. And that's what they try to make it seem like.
People will take real physiological differences, like I get tired on my period or my testosterone is lower or whatever. They take real things and then they use it to say that's why you should train this way. And it's like, I think that's a leap like a logical leap?
A lot of the female fitness space is them taking hypotheses and programming you based off physiological hypotheses and not actual, like, either it hasn't been studied or isn't shown in studies. And also on the note of the study thing, that's another rant I have too, is people act, they're like, women are understudied. And I'm like, yeah, but less data and needing more data doesn't mean we have no data. Because we did these invisible sportswomen studies. We looked into this. And like, yes, only 6% of studies in the top 5 journals were done exclusively on women-specific things. And only like 32 or 34% of participants are women. But like, that's a percentage, right? Relative versus percentage versus totality. And like, I've scoured some of these top journals. Like, there are still like hundreds of studies being done on women. Now, do we need better quality and consistency and methodology? Yeah, of course. But like, so some of the cycle syncy stuff or the female phys stuff, I'm like, yes, some of that is methodological incongruencies, but also like if these things were so robust that this was such an overriding physiological response, it would override so much of the noise in this data, right? It wouldn't be like, well, this study had this phase and this study had this phase and this study showed no effect. Like, I think there would be a lot more consistency that we would see. Again, methodology would also clear that up. But the studies that are good with methods where they test hormones and they run correlations and relationships of the hormones versus response, they're actually the ones that are seeing no effect. Yeah, I hate when people are like, but women are underrepresented. So I'm like, okay, so because we're understudied and underrepresented, we're just going to make shit up and that's better than pulling from the little data that we do have. Like, I'm like, I don't understand how like your rationalization then is like, let's just make hypotheses up. So a good example is like, everyone's like, okay, you should push harder during ovulation because your testosterone is boost. One, testosterone is not even the biggest player when it comes to strength and hypertrophy adaptations. Like, honestly, after puberty, that's not what is even driving like the biggest difference is. Like, you guys just grow a lot more when you go through puberty, and that sets a big difference across life. But like, our relative responses to like muscle growth are pretty similar between men and women, right? Like, those studies have shown that like relative to your body size, we have similar like adaptation potential and things like that. But that wouldn't even be for me the rationalization of why maybe late follicular or ovulatory phase stuff is more advantageous. If it is, it would be estrogen is higher. Like that makes more sense. Like that physiological rationalization like makes sense to me. And we have studies that kind of show that and some that like don't. And so I'm like, okay, well, if you just want to push harder when you feel better, guess what? That accounts for like most of that.
Me too.
Right, me too, right? Kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I think we see a lot of, one, that you should do specific types of exercise in different phases of your cycle. I think that is so stupid. I also think for Gen Pop regular people, let's change your exercise program that you're barely adherent to every single week of your month. And even like, it doesn't make any sense to me because we know that like repeated bout effect reduces the stress and or like how stressful that exercise bout is on people. So if we're worried about protecting you during the luteal phase and menstrual phase, wouldn't it make sense to do the same thing, but just adjust intensity or volume? Like if we're going to change anything across the cycle, my approach would be like just let's adjust intensity, volume, or zones of perception, RPE, which is pretty much auto regulation, right? Yeah. Like let's just like scale variables to how you feel or how you respond, which I'm totally okay with. Like people think that I'm like, you shouldn't factor your cycle at all. And I'm like, well, like if you feel like ass, just do RPE 6. Like keep doing the same thing or cut it from 3 sets to 2. Like that's not cycle syncing though. That's just like if you came in the gym and you slept like trash and everything felt heavier, we would just scale down, right? Like we're more than our hormones. So I think that there's this implication that like hormones override everything else that affects physical fitness, performance, and adaptation. There's some interesting data that shows like a lot of the differences that we see in performance have more to do with like psychological perception, response, and pain perception than it does actually like the hormonal physiology. And I always like to make sure that people know like that doesn't mean how you feel or perceived is invalid. Like people come online and be like, how you feel is fake. Well, it's not fake. How you feel is real. But how you feel and your pain perception is probably impacting how you feel in the gym and why you're lifting less more than progesterone being high. And we're even seeing some new studies coming out showing that like we had this idea that progesterone, because it was higher in the luteal phase, that you turned over more protein, you needed more protein, it wasn't as good to lift. But we're seeing actually like these protein synthesis differences in like muscle biopsies like aren't actually that different. And that's a stance that I've changed recently. I've always been on the stance of like, well, there might be greater protein turnover, so maybe you're bumping it up a little bit here, or you're increasing the timing around your workouts, which that's not harmful advice, right? Like maybe it's doing something, but also like having a higher protein intake across the entire month is probably just like the better things for that. So we see that. Then we also see like the whole, like your body's going to fall apart or you're going to gain weight or get fat if you work out in your late luteal menstrual cycle phases. Cortisol boogeyman, high and hard intensity is destroying your hormones. a lot of the stuff that I think deserves more nuance to what it is.
Yeah.
Versus like, well, it's not intensity. It's that a lot of women undereat while overdoing intensity because they're trying to use exercise as like a fat loss mechanism. So that is down-regulating hormones or leaving you overly stressed and fried. So yes, you should theoretically do less, but it should just be better programming, right? Like good programming that polarizes or pyramidizes your either lifting or your cardio capacity, and eating enough in response to that fixes 90% of those things, mixed with we're giving this advice to a lot of women who are undertrained. Like women are they are meeting the physical activity guidelines significantly less than males, especially strength training, or they are doing, if they are exercising, they're usually overdoing it or doing it like from like a let me slam group fitness 6 days a week and eat no carbs kind of a way. And that's not all women, but that's like where we're, and that's where things go haywire. And that marketing capitalizes on those people because they're like, do you feel like crap? Guess what? Cortisol is killing you and your fitness classes are making you fat. Do Pilates only and you're follicular and like.
I feel like there's a lot of mixed messaging like to men versus women, or when it's a guy, it's like, oh, you're stressed. Like, you know what's great for stress? Exercise. And it's like, oh, you're a girl and your cortisol is high. Like you need to stay home and read a book. It's like.
And I think it ignores the fact that one, exercise makes you more stress resilient and more adaptive. Two, the cortisol stress response isn't one necessary for it's part of that entire adrenal response to exercise that's necessary, or it's sending signals to your body to like release carbs and fat so you can use them for energy metabolism.
Yeah.
3, you adapt to it over time. 4, like if you stay below like a certain threshold of intensity, it doesn't actually rise that much. Or if your blood glucose levels stay stagnant, it doesn't increase as much, right? And there is a small degree of truth that women are probably a little bit more like stress sensitive in the sense of like, you know, there's a lot of arguments around if fasted training is bad or good for women. And we are more sensitive to energy deficits. And there's a lot of issues with like low energy availability. And within day energy availability stuff might be just as bad as that. But there's the nuance of that. Like if you're someone who has, you know, you're very sedentary and you're overweight, if you train fasted, you're probably not destroying your hormones or killing yourself. But if I was to train for my hyrox and marathon training fasted, I probably would be doing a detriment to myself.
So I have a question on that. Like a theory I have based on my limited knowledge of like the physiological differences that I'm curious if you think is accurate or totally off base, is that women's stress sensitivity, as you say, is going to make certain things that are suboptimal about training, like for example, training fasted. I think you're going to see a bigger effect size with women because the sensitivity's there. Yeah. It doesn't mean that it's good for men. It's just the effect size might be tougher to find.
Yes.
So studying like women's fitness might be a good way to be like, hey, this is actually the best way to train.
Yeah.
And we should apply this to men too.
That's not a bad thought. And like, that's even, I mean, that's kind of spot on too when you see the energy availability stuff. The threshold of which men and women see like hormonal decline or physiological like implications is different. So for women, it's like you want to be eating like 40 to 45 roughly grams per kilogram of fat-free mass, which people hate when you say that because it makes no fucking sense to anyone how much that actually is. Versus men, like they can go down to closer to like 35 before they start to see it, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
Right.
Right. And that doesn't mean that undereating is good for men. They just have a little bit more tolerance of when they start to down regulate. But I agree with that to some degrees. Like we're probably potentially having that heightened like response to things, especially when it comes to that kind of stuff. Like, I mean, that's the fasted training is such a point of contention in the industry. And I don't know why people are so obsessed with it. Yeah. They're so obsessed with it being the better, correct thing to do. Mixed with, I think there's a lot of like regular people who work jobs. They're like, I can't eat before I work out. And I'm like, just give yourself like a little bit of carbs. Like it doesn't need to be like a 5-course meal. And I think that also drives into that all or nothing. If people are thinking like, oh, I have to like get up an hour earlier and eat a whole breakfast. And I'm like, drink a glass of orange juice.
I was talking to a guy the other day who's like, yeah, I just can't like set aside the time to like have a meal prep to like eat throughout for the gym, whatever. And I'm like, well, what are you currently doing now? And he's like, nothing. Like I won't have had eaten like all day. I'm like, well, just have like a protein bar or something. And people are always like, well, that's not ideal. Like
what you're doing is not ideal anyway.
It's better than what you're doing.
Yeah.
Now. Like you can meet in the middle. Like you don't have to be perfect or just I'm not going to eat.
Yeah. Like, yeah, you might get not getting the perfect 1.2 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate before every workout. That is optimal. But like getting in 30 grams and maybe even 5 to 10 grams of protein just to have some amino acids in your bloodstream is like probably better than like having nothing. But it's hard because the fasted training thing is a big point of contention in the female phys space. And I'm like, well, if you are like somebody, and you have to be, I'm very delicate around conversations of body fatness and weight because I know that's very sensitive and like, but it's like if you have more body fatness or adiposity, it's probably not a big deal. Or it might even, because we have data on fasted training in women that are like categorically overweight or obese by research standards. Like that's how they classify it. Where you see improved hormones because they were in an energy deficit and then lost weight, or even with women with the PCOS and things like that. So like there's some nuance there of like, is this optimal? No, but in this state, is it like being catastrophic to them? Well, maybe not. You know what I mean? Versus like, yeah, if you have performance goals or you want to maintain muscle or run faster, harder, like you should probably just eat something. Yeah, it's like the fasted training and the cortisol boogeyman and the cycle syncing. And like, there's some nuance to all of it, but people make it very like, women need an entirely different way to train and you're in your masculine and you're only training like men and blah, blah, blah. And it's destroying your body. And I'm like, why don't we see these elite CrossFitters and marathoners and hyrox athletes gaining tons of weight from their training, right? Like there's probably something else going on here. You know what I mean? So,
and I don't know about every sport, but I've seen in some sports, at least when they compare like top level men versus women and look at like their training as a percentage. I think there was a cycling study that showed elite female cyclists spent more time in high intensity zones than elite male cyclists.
And that's where some of the nuance comes, I think, with the whole like women shouldn't do zone 2 thing. The statement should be women can handle or need higher percentages of intensity work to get the same stimulus as men, right? Because we are more oxidative. Low fitness women don't need more high intensity. They just need to start training and building volume capacity. Like my mom who only walks, I'm not giving her 3 days a week of sit as a postmenopausal woman because that's optimal for blah, blah, blah. Like that's stupid, right? But people with a good base or well training, like you can handle that slightly higher percentage potentially of higher intensity work, or we need it for the same relative stimulus that men get by nature from being slightly more like glycolytic or things like that. So there's that slight nuance there. And that's where I think that gets lost in the sauce because then women are freaking out and thinking, well, like, wait, zone 2 is all the rage and people are saying I'm not healthy or I'm not going to be fit if I don't do zone 2 training. And I'm like, one, it still ties back into how much cardio you do per week, right? If you're doing under the exercise guidelines or only the exercise guidelines, I literally just don't give a shit. Do a little bit of easy, do a little bit of hard, do a little bit of everything, right? Just spread it out. But then it's like, okay, I was running 10 to 15 hours a week last year, right? If I'm doing that at 50% intensity, I'm going to die. Like I'm not going to be able to do that at that. I may be doing 10 to 20% of intensity, right? With that versus right now, I pulled back my mileage to like 20 miles a week and I am probably closer to like 50% of my week is intensity, but I'm only doing like 3 hours of cardio a week versus like 10 to 15, right? There's always those nuances. So it comes down to the fact that just women can either handle or need slightly more of that intensity to get a similar stimulus, right? Where men might just need more of the easy stuff to get that physiological advantage that women have. But it's just, the issue is all the takes are polarizing to get clicks. And they lose that nuance. So then everyone's panicking that they're like destroying their fitness or health. And they're not. The same thing happens with lifting with women similarly, where they're like, women can handle more volume. And I think there is a degree of truth to that with women can handle like more volume in the sense of like, there's less neuromuscular efficiency as you get closer to that 1 rep max. So like we're able to do a higher percent for more reps, but we're not as absolutely strong as that would predict. Where men might not be able to do as much volume at a high weight, but you guys are stronger at that absolute maximal capacity, right?
I don't know if you saw the video I did with Tim.
I haven't. Everyone's raving about it. I've been busy being in Africa and at a wedding. So I'll have to watch it.
We did hack squats and we did a top set and then a back down. We had approximately the same 1 rep max. He was like 5% heavier than me.
Yeah.
But when we went down, he ended up doing 10 reps at like 80%. And I did 21 reps at 85%. And it's like, I'm not a woman, but there's that much individual variation just across
people. And that's what makes it so hard because everyone wants to say that there's differences between women and there is with some things, but like, I don't know, like I've trained with these guys, right? And I can keep up with their training or do more sometimes in some things, but not in other things, right? This is my hot take is that I actually think women would be better off if they train more like men, but that's like, get the pitchforks out. Like I don't train that differently than my male coaches.
Or coming off of generations of women training like not how they should.
I know people are like, don't train like a man, train like a woman. I was like, but actually I think it's actually so funny though, because then when you look at the fitness advice they're giving people, they're literally just repackaging high protein and lifting. That was actually one of my sassy male comments on YouTube once. I made this video about like tips for training for your first 50K.
Yeah.
And a lot of my content, I'm talking largely to the 90% of people who are consuming my content, right?
Yeah.
But this one guy was like, this is really dumb advice. I only trained for 6 weeks and it was fine. And I'm like, well, one,
Yeah.
like you probably have some sort of baseline that you're not acknowledging this
Yeah.
comment. Two, some people do. They just do dumb things and they're fine. Do that. But for most of you,
Yeah.
you can't just do that.
My dad, like when I started running marathons, he's completely untrained, like doesn't work out at all. And he's like, I'll do it.
Yeah.
And he'll just show up and run a marathon in like 4 hours.
How much do you think of that is contributes though to like your lifelong athleticism? Like I can handle like if I actually like can find the time for it, I can handle a shit ton of training volume.
Yeah.
But I think it's because in high school, I was crazy and I would bike to the annex, lift with the football players, run sprints with my brother's team afterwards, and or do my own lacrosse speed workout, and then like come home. Or I'd run to the chiropractor where I lifted at, and then run to the Y and lift. And I would do like 3 to 5 hour workouts. Now, was that ideal?
Yeah.
No, but I was doing that like as
I had some of that
kid.
too. But
You
I
know
think
what I
we
mean?
partly we sorted ourselves into that.
That's true, we did.
Because we can.
Yeah, because I think
And-
about that a lot with people who like want to jump into like I always say like, because everyone wants to do the high volume training. I'm like, you can, but you have to earn it. Like you have to like build up to it. And there's such a difference between, I feel like people who like us, or I guess we have genetic self-sorting, but also like that lifelong exposure of like in college, I was working out 2 to 4 hours a day.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So like when I quit college and got into sport or like recreational fitness, doing a lift and teaching a group fitness class and running on the same day wasn't like,
Yeah. Are you more of a squatter or a hinger?
hinder. My best deadlift was 400 and my best squat was 305.
I can RDL almost as much as I can regular deadlift.
What's your favorite lift to push then? It doesn't have to be
Lunges.
compound.
Lunges.
Lunges?
Yeah.
I guess that's true. You do all those stupid lunges.
Yeah.
You know what I think is the dumbest waste of time lift of all time?
What?
The hip thrust.
I have thoughts on the hip thrust.
Do you?
Yeah.
I just think it's such a waste of time. That sounds so mean. People don't like that take.
I mean,
I think it's helpful in some contexts and I do use it sometimes, but I think for most people, I just think it's not, I say women get mad when I say this because they love their hip thrust.
I think it's a lift that you can gamify a lot.
That's a good point.
And I think you can find ways to hip thrust a shit ton of weight without delivering a big stimulus. I think single leg hip thrusts are great.
That actually helped me a lot with my rehab recovery of this glute thing.
Yeah.
Single leg hip thrust, high box step ups, and then the cross step ups were like the glue that has held me together for the last 2 years.
I know not everyone has access to every machine in the world, but I would pick a like 45-degree hyper or kickback machine, like a stable kickback machine. I'd pick those over hip thrusts for terminal hip extension. So like I get more out of it.
You know what I really want?
What?
The Rogue Donkey.
Yeah.
I want the weighted reversed
I've never cared for reverse hypers
really
myself.
I
Yeah.
fucking love them.
Really?
I really like them. Of all the things that I've done, I've always really liked those. I've never really done a ton of machine training, although I think the one thing that I would want would be a quad extension.
Yeah, leg extension's great.
Yeah.
With everyone's all length and bias, everything in the hypertrophy space, but I'm like, I don't know, like loading some end range, like short position E.
Yeah.
I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, everyone has their takes on everything, right? I definitely fall in that parabola on this side where it's like just train hard. Bicep curls are dumb and a waste of time.
Oh, yeah.
Bicep curls. And people get really confused because I'll make jokes a lot that bicep curls are the most important thing to train when you're like running or hyper training, but I'm joking. Like
Yeah.
I'm joking because it's like, it's not, but it's like you look,
Yeah.
I'm definitely on the other end of the parabola now where it's like bicep
I
curls
think
and
bicep
just
curls
train
are-
hard.
I think bicep curls are really important for, like, I train a lot of elderly women,
Mhm.
and I see so many people who are like, oh, just like replicate daily life, like farmers carries and box squats. But then I'll like my elderly client, I won't say her name on the podcast, but like she was struggling when she started the bicep curl 2.5 pounds. And I'm like, there's so many things in life where you need to be able to lift up your arm and like hold something.
I'm definitely more of the camp of like a little bit of bro work all the time.
Yeah. I'd gotten her to a 25-pound dumbbell row,
Oh, that's awesome.
but like still could barely curl 5 pounds,
Yes.
you know?
Yeah.
It's like, I think we need to work on that.
Yeah, we should probably train that up. That is a good point of that. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that sometimes people get very, especially Gem Pop, they're like, Gem Pop needs nothing but this. But I'm like, yeah, but
Yeah.
When are you isolating that? And that's not good. If you can't curl
Yeah.
2.5 pounds, it's
Well, and when we curled fives, like it hurt her wrist. And
Yeah.
like she had pain in her forearms and her wrist. I'm like, that's not good.
I even forget how detrained some people are. There's a difference between just like regular people who are beginners where they can kind of start with stuff
Right.
versus like people who are so detrained in certain things that you don't even think about
Yeah.
that.
Do you want you can use these straps if you want.
No, I got a really good jump and a really good grip.
You got everything I don't. It's actually usually my zercher day, so
You want to zercher deadlift that?
I'm switching to my like straight leg
Go for it.
zercher.
I'll try. Well, I'll try your zercher deadlift.
You're gonna try it?
Yeah, I'll try it, but I'm gonna have to
Alright.
take off some weight so I don't break my spine.
Hell yeah.
Graded exposure. I also have never been a like a die-hard perfect former on my stuff too, so I probably have enough.
I was a diehard perfect form person for such a long time that like building up the strength in that was it's a process.
Yeah. All right, let's see if I can even.
You gotta.
Fuck. How do you get into this?
Yeah, look at that. Looks good. Yeah, reach with the shoulders. You gotta like actively
There we go.
protract. Yeah.
Forearms are the weak link here.
Yeah, it takes some time. Don't toughen up.
I'm glad I have an appropriately bendy spine though for the
I thought that looked really
the
good.
podcast.
Yeah.
You've done GDR, right?
Yeah. I did it. Probably my favorite race like in the world. Like I really
Yeah.
want to do it again.
Listen, Alec, ultimate content duo. We do GDR at the same time. Let's see, I'm at 20 pounds, but
Yeah, you got it. You got to reach with the arms. Don't try to hug it. Yeah.
oh, that hurts your arms.
Yeah, it's not pleasant the first like 8 times you do it, honestly.
You have a very different clientele where you can just give them whatever and they do it.
My favorite client story, shout out Kim. I used to program in Training Peaks, and there's different icons. There's like the strength icon, swim icon, row icon. For a long time, I gave Kim, it was like a recovery row. It was like just 20-minute zone 2 row. 1 week, I accidentally hit the swim icon. Found
she
the
did it?
pool. She did it.
Oh
She
my
just
God, I
went
love
to the
that.
pool and did
So
it.
literal.
I was like, you're the best.
Yeah, I try to, and I don't want it to seem like I'm hating on my clients. I just know that they take things so literally and they want to do it so right that I try
Yes.
to make it as easy as possible for them to like do that and feel successful with it. But I love that story.
We were talking about women being the most adherent clients.
Yeah. Well, that's why like I'm very aware of our clients, and a lot of them, they do have that, like, they're like, I want to do everything to a T and I won't scale or swap or adjust
Yeah.
if I don't. So I try to like build in those cushion factors.
Don't know if I can do this after squatting, but I just want to give it a whirl.
Give it a sin. That's disgusting.
First one's always tough.
That's like a big thing to point out with like the way I program for my clients is like, if there's 2 barbell lifts, the rest of everything I give them will be like easy to circuit or accessorize or be in one place and then gym with, and also reduces the like
I'm big on.
hassle of the loading and unloading. You know what I mean? Like I think about that stuff because it's like,
I prioritize that over what's like theoretically optimal from like an order perspective.
yeah,
And people will ask, they'll be like, well, shouldn't we do this first? I'm like, the workout just flows so much better this way.
yeah. It's
And
a
to
lot
me,
easier.
That's more important.
And it is sometimes easier than you can tell the clients who are more advanced, like, well, you could just do this with a barbell if
Yeah.
you need that more weight.
Yeah.
Versus like, hey, I know that when you're done with the barbell in the gym, it's easier for me to just give you stuff where you can sit in a corner
Yeah.
and like,
Well, I like to program, I'll program like antagonist supersets. Not like strict, like fly back and forth, but like
yes.
do a set of hamstrings, do a set of quads. And I'm not going to program 2 barbell lifts at the same time.
No, if I superset anything with a barbell, it's usually like either a pull up or a plyo or a core or something that's like not hard to like do at the same period of time. Like I really think a lot about gym setups for people. That's where I got to catch up with Katie. She's like overhead pressing like 78-pound bells or something dumb like that.
Her overhead is really strong.
Nuts.
I've talked with a lot of women who they're not in great shape. They know that their hormones are out of whack. They have the blood work to back it up, but they're under the impression that like they need to address their hormones before they address their fitness. How much truth is there to that? Like how much is it like, yeah, you need to get these other things in order before you train at a certain intensity? Or is it just like meet your fitness where it's at and just go for it all?
So I don't think like we have like a concrete study that says you should do this, right? Because also hormones being messed up means different things to different people. Are you, do you have suppressed sex hormones because you are, like you have luteal phase deficiency or you're missing ovulation? Because those people, especially if it's coming from like an under eating, overtraining thing, that's the tricky conversation in the data of, okay, well, a lot of people, because exercise is kind of addictive in those situations for them, or, overdoing it or whatever. And you can also have like low energy availability without the stress of exercise. The stress of life can cause that. That's where it's tricky, where like you might have to pull back or do less or take a break as your body kind of like restores that, like getting below that threshold of stress, or bringing up food to that too, right? Because like, especially you're like saying they're out of shape, right? So if it's an under eating thing or an over stress of life thing, there is a degree of truth of like, hey, maybe we are not sending it and we're working within the parameters of the stress and the capacity that we have, with also like meeting yourself where you're at. Because for a lot of those people, their work capacity is so low, but it doesn't mean I don't think you should stop training, because there's also stress resilience that you build and or hormone regulation that comes from training. So I don't think that is something that you need to avoid, but like keeping in check with parameters of what you're dealing with, versus if hormones are off in the sense of like you have PCOS or insulin resistance, or you're metabolically unhealthy, well, then exercise is actually going to help improve those metrics, right? Insulin sensitivity will improve, and then therefore, triglyceride regulation will improve. Those things will start to be more regulated, and or you might not fully fix the hormone issue, right? Like that's exercise. Like exercise isn't going to reverse or cure perimenopause or PCOS or anything like that, but it can help with regulation of some of the negative effects of, because also like insulin and glucose and like those things are also hormones, right? When we think about that. And so it's like a delicate balance of like, okay, is your management of your hormones either due to poor lifestyle and we need to improve the lifestyle from an exercise, nutrition, sleep support standpoint from that, or is it overstress, down regulation, whether that's from exercise, food, or environmental, right? And doing that within the parameters of like what you can tolerate. Because for some people, if they can eat enough and sleep enough and pull back whatever's causing that external thing to them, they might be able to train a little bit more. But if you are really overdoing it, you might need to pull that back quite a bit to let your body like actually recover. But I'm always really careful with that, because when people hear that, they're like, see, intensity and exercise is bad. I'm like, well, no, you're just overly stressed. So you need to pull it back to the point of which you can then recover from. When people are very sedentary or undertrained, I'm very hesitant to ever say you shouldn't be physically active. I just think maybe you're not jumping into 6 days a week Orange Theory or doing 6 HIIT sessions a week. Maybe you are. This is where I think like the zone 2 easy steady state cardio and or entry level weightlifting is a great starting point, because it's not super, no one who's starting out weightlifting is training at 80 to 90% on their winter max. They're underloading themselves, right, to begin with. So it's not really that stressful on your body, but it's a novel stress. So it's still that mixed with like, maybe it is walking, you know what I mean? But like thinking about how can you integrate movement and physical activity, maybe more so into your life, or keep it at a steady minimum while you address those factors, versus like if it's coming from like, oh, I've been sedentary, but I'm also have a lot of dysregulation metabolically. Well, exercise is probably going to actually help expedite the healing of those things. And I mean, my blood work was an absolute hot mess disaster when I finished my PhD. I was super burnt out, breaking out, gut issues. I was the poster child of a cortisol gut health thing. Like I was like, if I didn't know any better, every single one of these marketing tactics would have been like me to a T, right? And I never stopped training, but I did pull back. I mean, getting out my PhD helped a lot, but I did have to really learn how to manage my stress better, reprioritize my sleep, improve my nutrition. And then I did adjust train. Like I didn't race an ultra that year. Like that is a huge stressor on your body, right? But I didn't stop doing like cardio or weightlifting. I just made sure that I addressed everything else in my life that was causing those things more than the training itself, which most people say, remove the training. That's causing all of those things. And it wasn't, but that wasn't the causal for me, right? And I was able to adjust the other stressors than that and heal while still training. But there's that fine line of like, do you have that sense of responsibility to manage your volume and intensity and recoverability and stress of that appropriately while you are still like healing and doing these other things? And that's where coaches can come in and help, right? So I'm hesitant to ever say don't train, but that's where I think, unfortunately, a lot of the blanket advice for women hurts them, because hormone dysregulation can come from many different things. It can come from lack of adequate nutrition. It can come from overtraining. It can come from a disorder or hormonal state like perimenopause or PCOS or whatever that is. Or it can be dysregulated from excess adiposity or metabolic dysregulation, all that stuff. So I think it really just depends on the person, and it's more of an adjustment of what you're doing kind of thing. And for some people, it is a pulling it back, right? But for some people, it's a, hey, actually, like we should still push this, but let's take it slow and titrate it kind of thing. What's the number one way to reduce the cortisol response to exercise training? Be fed.
Yeah.
If you're worried about your morning cortisol response, don't train fasted. Have carbs in you. Like that blunts the response because your body's not having to try to compensate by pulling that from storage because it's less stressful, right? If you eat enough on your long runs, then your cortisol response doesn't go like this gradually in response to the run. It just stays here because you're keeping yourself fed the entire time. Like people, these are the nuances that are left out of like, well, if you're just well fed and you train in a manageable way, usually 90% of the things that people scare you out of like are non-issues. I don't think a lot of women understand that if they ate more, they'd likely expend more because they'd have more energy to like function.
The biggest difference I've noticed as I've been more deliberate with just, I use a lot of like cyclic dextran and carb powders just to like help me reach my like recommended intake. And it's like, I could still get through the training and get through life and like do everything before. But if I just like throw an extra 200 grams of carbs in the day, I do it all. And then I like still feel like going for a walk with my wife like in the afternoon. Whereas before it's like, I'm done.
And you just recover so much better, especially the intra-run nutrition. I think that's like, not even a female specific thing, but everyone with the hybrid athlete space kind of thing. And I'm like, the number one trick I have from recovering from your runs so you can still crush your lifting is to eat carbs on your runs. Like, I don't think people realize how much that helps with either preventing excessive breakdown of your tissue when you're training or the recovery that you have in response to that. And like, I always say when I get back from my long runs, if I feel like I literally need to lay on the floor and I'm dying, I didn't eat enough. But I should be able to go home and be like, hey, I have the appetite for a regular meal-ish, you know what I mean? Give or take, like once the initial response, I don't. But like, I should be able to eat. Like, I shouldn't have to be like, oh my God, if I don't order like the greasiest, friedest, most hyper-palatable thing in the world, I can't eat right now. And then be able to be like, hey, we can go to dinner later. Let's go to the store and walk around. Like, you should be able to like feel that. That's a good sign. And I think actually for a lot of people, that helps it click a little bit more for them because they're like, well, my training was fine, but like they always had shitty training. So they don't know what it feels to be like fed and trained.
Yeah. Even for shorter workouts, I'm like, I don't need to fuel, but I'm going to anyway.
You just feel better.
Just do 100 grams of carbs an hour, and then usually have like another 150 grams in a half gallon of orange juice. And like, I can get 300-400 grams of carbs in a big workout day just from that.
Yeah.
And I feel so much
I can't
better.
get to 100. I think the highest I got was like 78 grams per hour on my runs last year.
Well, that's fair. Like scaling for body weight.
Once I started eating like 60 plus grams an hour, and like, even for me, like a gram of sodium an hour or 800 grams of sodium, like pushing that, I'm like, I feel so much better. There's no way I'm doing cardio right now.
No.
I don't have enough sugar in my body.
You're going to do some fasted training?
No, I'm going to die.